Over the years, we've been looking at type 2 diabetes as almost exclusively, probably exclusively, as a disease of glucose. And we have some justification for having done that over time, because if you look at the life of a diabetic, and that's what I mean by the x-axis, I don't mean this in minutes, but rather years, we see the glucose starts to climb, and that is the fundamental feature with type 2 diabetes. However, I would say this is somewhat justifiable because historically and scientifically it made some sense. Historically, it made some sense because the main symptom of this disease was the polyuria. And that, of course, is driven by the hyperglycemia. So it makes sense. That was an obvious symptom. The flies coming to it and the dogs licking it. And just the incredible production. Then scientifically, it is so much easier to measure a nutrient as simple as glucose or even ketones. It is so easy to get that number as opposed to, say, hormones. You don't rapidly measure hormones. So glucose is easy to measure. But for a condition called insulin resistance, there is, of course, one character who's missing. And you know the punchline here. We have to shift this focus and start to scrutinize insulin to really appreciate insulin resistance. So if we superimpose what insulin would look like over the life of this person, it would look something like this. And so importantly, then, is that at the earliest stages of this disease, we have someone who could be normoglycemic and hyperinsulinemic. But because we look at the glucose problem, we don't detect it in time. We detect it years after. Indeed, it can be decades, as was noted in this paper in the early 90s. So we would know that decades before the glucose changes, the insulin has been waging this silent war in the body. It's fighting harder and harder and harder, but it is able to keep the glucose in control, and eventually it starts to lose the battle, and the glucose climbs.